So one of our top priorities in this mission is promoting greater affordability. Now, that's a word used by the Democrats. They're the ones that cause the problem. The one thing, they stick together. They don't have some of the people that we have. I don't know, it's a genetic thing. It's something in the blood. We got some real losers, mostly great, but I wouldn't use the name Romney because I'm in his sort of territory, so I would never use that name. But all right, I'll use it.
Okay, so Trump's entire America First agenda has just completely imploded in the most catastrophic way possible because all of his aggressive foreign policy moves have triggered massive international retaliation on a scale that no one could have predicted, and that is now tearing apart the very foundations of American economic strength and global standing that he claimed he was going to protect and enhance. I'm not talking about mere diplomatic protests or angry tweets flying back and forth across the ocean. I'm talking about real concrete economic sanctions and trade restrictions that countries around the world have slammed down on the United States in direct response to his escalations with the Iran strikes, the threats against longtime allies, the operations in Venezuela, and the endless cycle of tariffs and demands that treated every trading partner as an enemy to be bullied rather than a collaborator to be negotiated with in good faith. The European Union and China alone have imposed over $23 billion in counter-sanctions specifically targeting American exports, and that number is not some abstract figure pulled from thin air. It represents a direct hit on the backbone of the American economy, where farmers in the Midwest who have spent generations perfecting their soybean and corn crops suddenly find their largest markets slammed shut with no warning and no alternative buyers stepping in to fill the gap because those buyers have been driven away by the uncertainty and hostility coming out of Washington. American manufacturers who once relied on steady orders for machinery and technology components from Europe and Asia are now watching their assembly lines slow to a crawl as contracts dry up, warehouses fill with unsold inventory that cannot be moved overseas, and workers who showed up every day believing in the promise of strong leadership are the ones left holding the bag with pink slips in their hands and mortgages they can no longer afford because foreign markets have been closed off in retaliation for policies that were sold as America First, but have delivered America isolated and America hurting. This is happening while everything else in the administration is falling apart at the seams, and the chaos is compounding on itself in ways that make it impossible to pretend any of this is part of some brilliant master plan. Congress just rejected Trump's attempt to cut $9.4 billion in foreign aid, and that rejection came not from one side of the aisle, but from both parties working together because even many Republicans are starting to wake up to the reality that this foreign policy approach is not just ineffective but actively destructive to American interests at home and abroad. Trump wanted to redirect that money away from development programs and humanitarian assistance that have long been tied to U.S. exports, and he framed it as trimming waste. But the truth is, those programs require recipient countries to buy American products, to hire American contractors, and to employ American workers in everything from construction to agriculture to technology services. So when you slash that aid, you are not saving money, you are slashing American jobs directly. And Congress saw through the rhetoric and said no, because the data and the lived experience of constituents back home made it impossible to ignore. Yet Trump issued an executive order pausing foreign assistance anyway, just went ahead unilaterally as if the legislative branch did not exist, and analysts across the economic spectrum have estimated that single move is already killing 250,000 American jobs, a full 250,000 people either laid off or never hired in the first place, because the export markets and contracting opportunities that foreign aid helped create have been frozen in place. Think about what that means in human terms for a factory worker in Ohio who depended on contracts funded through aid programs to produce equipment shipped overseas, or a logistics specialist in Texas whose entire role revolved around moving American goods to countries that now have no incentive to keep buying because the aid pipeline has been cut off. These are not faceless bureaucrats or distant statistics. These are real families facing real hardships because a policy sold as tough and smart turned out to be short-sighted and self-defeating. We have removed over 300,000 bureaucrats from the federal payroll in an effort to streamline government, and yes, there were inefficiencies with sometimes 10 or 11 people assigned to tasks that could be handled by fewer, but you cannot run a country like a wrecking ball smashing through systems without considering the downstream effects on the broader economy, especially when those systems were supporting export-driven employment that kept communities afloat. The expression "Make America Great Again" rings hollow when the very actions taken under that banner are costing America jobs and closing American opportunities, and yet the administration keeps insisting everything is fine while the evidence piles up in the opposite direction. More people may be working in certain sectors of the United States than at any time in history, but that headline number hides the pain in the export-dependent industries where the retaliation is hit hardest, and many of those so-called lousy bureaucratic jobs were actually supporting American contractors and suppliers overseas through the aid programs that have now been paused. Foreign aid is not charity thrown away for nothing. It is an investment that requires countries to buy American, to use American expertise, and to keep American workers employed. And when you cut it unilaterally, you cut the jobs that come with it, and Trump did it anyway, because the understanding of these interconnected systems was never there. The stock market has been absolute carnage, with the S&P 500 losing roughly $4 trillion in value directly tied to the tariff policies and the international retaliation that followed. And $4 trillion is not just a big number on a screen. It is wealth destruction on a scale we have not seen since the depths of the financial crisis, with retirement accounts for millions of everyday Americans devastated, 401ks that were supposed to fund golden years now worth far less, and investment portfolios crushed under the weight of uncertainty that makes planning impossible for businesses large and small. American companies cannot make long-term decisions when they do not know what tariff will be announced next month or which country will retaliate next week, and that chaos is self-inflicted. It stems entirely from the reckless foreign policy that prioritized threats and escalation over stable relationships and predictable trade rules. Before going any further, it is worth acknowledging that trust in mainstream media has eroded for good reason, which is why independent voices and direct analysis matter more than ever. But the facts on the ground speak for themselves regardless of the source, and those facts show an economy reeling from policies that were supposed to deliver strength but have delivered isolation and pain, while the international sanctions are crushing American exporters and Congress is blocking key elements of the foreign policy funding, and the markets are tanking. What is happening on the political front on nothing short of complete collapse. Speaker Mike Johnson had to cancel House votes on April 16th because 9 Republicans defected on a critical war powers vote, meaning Trump's own party would no longer line up behind his military and foreign policy decisions, and that level of internal revolt forced the Speaker to shut down the chamber rather than suffer repeated embarrassing defeats on the floor. Trump has lost control of his own party, lost control of the economy, lost control of the narrative around foreign policy, and now his entire presidency is teetering on the edge of collapse with budget projections that are downright terrifying. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget has calculated that the failed tariff policies are creating a $1.7 trillion revenue shortfall through 2036 because the Supreme Court struck down most of those tariffs as illegal, removing the revenue stream Trump had counted on to offset tax cuts and spending, and the deficit is exploding as a result. The national debt is racing past $60 trillion with no realistic plan to fix it, because the entire economic strategy hinged on tariffs working as a magic bullet. And those tariffs are either now illegal or being met with retaliation that wipes out any supposed gains through lost exports and higher costs passed on to American consumers and businesses. The whole thing has collapsed, leaving massive debt, economic chaos, and no clear path forward. And Trump's only response has been more threats, more aggression, more tariffs, doubling down on the very approach that created the crisis, because admitting any mistake is simply not an option. He keeps escalating, making the situation worse with every new announcement, because changing course would require acknowledging failure, and that is something the administration cannot bring itself to do. So we are all watching the death spiral unfold in real time, with American workers and families paying the price every single day. Trump's term is near collapse as these massive sanctions hit, and that is not hyperbole. That is the actual situation playing out, with international sanctions crushing exports, congressional revolt blocking the agenda, markets in freefall, GOP defections paralyzing the House, and no end in sight because the underlying problems are structural and self-created. This disaster did not happen overnight. It is the result of months of deliberate escalation, where Trump imposed sweeping tariffs on China at 60% on Chinese imports, the highest levels in generations, and China responded in kind, hitting American agricultural products, manufacturing technology, and more so that farmers could no longer sell soybeans or other crops into that massive market, and manufacturers lost outlets for their goods, leading to job losses that rippled through supply chains and communities. Trump kept insisting it was working and that China was paying the price, but the reality was American consumers faced higher prices, American businesses lost markets, and American workers bore the brunt, while the trade war only intensified. Then the escalation moved to Europe, where threats of tariffs were used as leverage if European countries did not support the attempt to acquire Greenland from Denmark, turning trade policy into a tool of territorial ambition that European leaders saw as economic blackmail and unacceptable interference in sovereign matters, so they responded with their own counter tariffs targeting politically sensitive American exports like agricultural goods, manufactured products, and services designed to create pressure from within the United States on the administration from businesses and workers who were now hurting. The Venezuela operations added another layer with military actions aimed at regime change, prompting Latin American countries that trade with Venezuela to restrict American exports, form new preferential deals among themselves, and build economic partnerships that deliberately exclude U.S. businesses, so that what was already a failed military and political adventure became an economic liability as well, with regional retaliation costing even more American jobs. Adding it all up, you have over $23 billion in foreign sanctions and trade restrictions aimed squarely at American exports from the European Union, China, and Latin American responses, all happening at once, all directly traceable to the aggressive foreign policy choices, and all inflicting real damage on farmers who cannot sell their crops, manufacturers who cannot export their products, service providers locked out of markets, and hundreds of thousands of jobs lost in the process. Estimates vary, but the human cost is undeniable, with communities across the heartland and industrial regions feeling the pain of lost opportunities that were once guaranteed by stable trade relationships. The foreign aid situation only compounds the self-inflicted wound because Trump has viewed aid as wasteful giveaway from the beginning, ignoring that most of it is tied aid, requiring recipients to purchase American goods, hire American firms, and support American employment. So cutting it is not fiscal responsibility, it is cutting the very jobs programs that kept export markets alive. The attempt to secure $9.4 billion in cuts was rejected by Congress, with Republicans and Democrats alike recognizing the job-killing consequences, but the executive order pausing assistance went through anyway, and that pause alone is estimated to cost 250,000 American jobs, freezing programs that would have employed workers in everything from engineering to agriculture to logistics, and leaving a vacuum that foreign competitors are happily filling. The stock market freefall is the most visible symptom, with $4 trillion wiped out cumulatively as every new tariff announcement, every retaliation, and every wave of uncertainty sends indices tumbling, retirement savings evaporating, college funds shrinking, and businesses unable to invest or expand because the trade environment changes week to week, creating pure economic chaos that was entirely avoidable. The fiscal picture is equally bleak, with the $1.7 trillion revenue shortfall through 2036 stemming from the Supreme Court rulings invalidating tariffs and the export losses from retaliation, meaning the government is taking in far less than projected, while spending pressures remain and the debt climbs towards $60 trillion, with interest payments consuming ever larger portions of the budget and no coherent strategy to close the gap because the tariff-centric plan has collapsed. Politically, the fallout is accelerating, with the April 16th House vote cancellation after 9 Republican defections on war powers, revealing a party no longer unified behind the Iran-Venezuela operations or the broader foreign policy, and Speaker Johnson choosing to shut down proceedings rather than face more losses because the caucus is fracturing under pressure from constituents in competitive districts who are furious about the economic pain. Farmers losing Chinese markets, manufacturers shut out of Europe, workers affected by aid cuts, and business owners unable to plan amid
constant policy whiplash.
Those defections are not random. They reflect real anger from voters who see their livelihoods damaged by policies that were promised to deliver strength, and those representatives are now prioritizing their own political survival over blind loyalty, creating distance from the agenda even as it risks dying on the floor. The Iran situation in particular has backfired spectacularly, with the naval blockade disrupting global shipping threats to close the Strait of Hormuz, spiking oil prices, military strikes creating market uncertainty, and then the inability to enforce ultimatums, leaving credibility shattered, oil prices still elevated, and shipping routes still troubled, all for no strategic gain. And Republicans, looking at the mess, are increasingly unwilling to defend it, voting against war powers, measures to constrain further escalation. This panic within Republican leadership, with votes canceled and agendas stalled, is an admission that control has been lost, and with midterms approaching, the implications are catastrophic as Democrats prepare to campaign on the tangible results of lost jobs, devastated retirement accounts, and locked out markets, while Republicans struggle to offer any convincing counter because the numbers and the stories from home districts do not lie. Wrapping this all together, the international sanctions and economic retaliation mean the core America First promise that has defined the agenda since 2016 has failed spectacularly, and the consequences will shape the remainder of the term and the political landscape for years to come. Breaking it down into the key realities: first, the economic damage is permanent and accelerating. Those $23 billion in sanctions will not vanish overnight, even if some tariffs are lifted, because other countries will maintain them as leverage punishment and protection against future unpredictability, leaving American exporters locked out of critical markets for the long term, with farmers, manufacturers, and service providers suffering lasting competitive losses and thousands of jobs in agriculture industry and beyond disappearing because the bluff of bullying partners was called and met with hard countermeasures. The $4 trillion in stock market wealth destruction is not abstract. It has erased retirement savings, evaporated college funds, reduced investment capital for growth, and made consumers feel poorer, leading to reduced spending, manufacturing weakness, declining business investment, and forward indicators, all pointing toward recession, fueled by the policy uncertainty and trade war fallout that Trump himself created through unpredictable tariffs, constant threats, and failure to follow through. The fiscal hole of $1.7 trillion in lost revenue through 2036, combined with exploding deficits and debt approaching $60 trillion, leaves no room for maneuvering as interest payments balloon, and the original strategy of tariffs funding everything lies in ruins. Second, the political collapse is accelerating and becoming the new normal, with Republican defections on war powers and other votes no longer isolated incidents, but a pattern driven by the inability of members in swing districts to defend the chaos to their constituents, who are living the consequences of lost export markets and frozen aid programs, and every defection makes the next one easier, weakening the speaker, further exposing the fractures and emboldening more opposition, while the administration doubles down, unable to change course without admitting the policies have failed. This death spiral for the agenda is self-perpetuating, and the midterm outlook for the GOP looks grim, with Democrats armed with a powerful message of economic disaster, lost jobs, and market losses that voters can see and feel in their daily lives, leaving Republicans with no effective defense and facing potential losses in the House and Senate seats. Third, impeachment momentum is building, not purely from partisan desire, but from the cumulative weight of failures that make it politically viable and even necessary in the eyes of increasing numbers of lawmakers: the unauthorized Iran actions, the economic mismanagement, the party revolt, the court losses, and broader concerns about fitness, all compounding into justification that even some Republicans may eventually find hard to ignore, especially as more economic indicators worsen, more sanctions land, more jobs disappear, and more defections occur, pushing the calculation toward removal as a way to salvage the party rather than go down with a sinking ship.